All right, one more time, welcome. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Saturday. And I want to thank everybody for being here and sharing your Saturday with us. And we at Arizona Historical Society are extremely pleased to bring you this important program. So I think we're going to get started. Please make sure that your video is off and that you are muted so that we may get a high quality recording of this program. And I'm going to do a short introduction, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Nadia Granados. So first, our program today, Somos Bilingües, Voices of Graduates of a Dual Language School. Today, you are joined by Eric Gonzalez, who is our statewide facilities manager, and myself. I am the managing editor of the Journal of Arizona History at the Arizona Historical Society, and Eric and I want to thank you for joining us today. Arizona Historical Society was established by an act of the first territorial legislature back in November of 1864. AHS is Arizona's oldest historical agency. We take pride in that. Our mission is to connect people through the power of Arizona's history, and this is why we bring you these important programs, and we thank you for your support in helping us continue our mission, because this is incredibly important to preserve and protect the history. To help do this, our new license plate is now available, this beautiful monsoon plate, and a portion of the proceeds come right back to AHS to help preserve our mission and preserve Arizona history. So take a look at it, plus it's a really beautiful monsoon license plate. You can also come visit us. We are now open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. We adhere to strict CDC guidelines, so come in, feel safe, and come look at some new exhibits that that are open and are going to be opening. So visit our website /tickets to get your tickets today. Those two exhibits, Unframed, a photo journey through Navajo and Hopi nations, 1977 through 1978. A new exhibition featuring the beautiful photography of artist Catherine McKenna. It's already open at our Arizona Heritage Center at Papago Park up in Tempe. Come take a look at it, it's amazing. And our next exhibit ready to launch, Arizona's Place in Space. This is super exciting, and we are really excited to come see this. So it opens on May 20th, so get your tickets now. If you can't visit us in person and you like these virtual programs, that's awesome, because we are committed to bringing you these programs. Our next one is The Senator Was a Ham. Get it, ham radio? I know, I don't write this stuff. Barry Goldwater and the Amateur Radios, Wednesday, May 19th. Next one, Cobre Sagrado, Studying the Sacred Copper on the Borderlands of New Spain, is Thursday, May 27th, a nice evening one also. And then the next one is New Directions in Arizona History, is featuring some of the most decorated, most important historians of Arizona. Talk about our newest, our kind of new issue, State of the Field. And you're going to have a great roundtable with all of these authors on Saturday, June 5th. This is going to be a great program, so sign up now. To get the best deal, become a member. Unlimited free admission to our museums, 10% discount at the museum gift shops. They've got really cool stuff. And a subscription to the award-winning Journal of Arizona History quarterly issues. This is the State of the Field issue that I was just talking about. It's available on Project Muse. And again, as a member, you get access to it as digital and in copy. So become a member. For all of this information, you can visit our website at azhs.org for the latest news and events. Now, off of my seal, I want to introduce Dr. Nadia Granados. She attended Brigham Young University for her undergraduate degree. She then earned her master's and doctorate degree from the Language, Reading, and Cultural program in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Sociocultural Studies at the University of Arizona. She has worked as a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Utah and currently teaches graduate and undergraduate courses. Her research interests include biliteracy, bilingualism, dual language education, community literacies, literary literacy processes, academic literacies, and women's literacies. Her research has been published in the Bilingual Research Journal and the Journal of Literacy Research. And she has also co-authored chapters in the field of language and literacy. She is also co-founder of Lingua Learner, a Spanish-English preschool curriculum for parents to use at home with their children. She and her husband Isaac have 3 daughters, ages 7, 5, and 1. She grew up playing guitar in a mariachi group and loves dancing folklorico. She has a passion for education, language, and literacy, and hopes to instill in her children a lifelong love of learning. And I'm really pleased that she is sharing her research and her expertise with us. And I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand it over to Dr. Granados, who will share her screen. And one last thing, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. And we will leave a little bit of time at the end so that hopefully Dr. Granados can answer your questions. And I give you the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you see my screen? Is it up? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Great. The title of my presentation today is Somos Bilingües, Voices of Graduates of a Dual Language School. To begin with a little bit of background, Dalton is a K-5 dual language immersion school. Dual language programs generally integrate 2 language backgrounds where there's an instructional setting where at least 50% of the curriculum is in the minority language. So what this means is that it is a unique type of bilingual education in which a classroom composed of native English speakers and native speakers of another language, in this case, Spanish, receive academic instruction in both languages, and each language is given equal importance. At this school, parents, teachers, school staff, and administrators all endeavored to foster both Spanish and English in a supportive and enriched language environment. So these students at this school developed and refined their bilingual and biliterate practices from an early age in these elementary school years. But the question is, what happened to these students after they left this setting? They experienced this complex, multi-layered range of language and literacy interactions inside the classroom as well as outside the classroom. And so they had this shared common denominator in their educational experiences during those early years, but then they continued on these multifaceted, dynamic, bilingual and biliterate journeys. So now these students are adults and they're graduates of this program, and they have important insights to offer about their lived experiences with language over the years. I also want to mention my own positionality. I was a student at Dalton, and as such, many of the participants in this research study were my peers or acquaintances or friends of my peers. And so I really took on this dual role as both researcher and participant and offer my perspectives as such. And so I went into this research with a few questions in mind. I wanted to understand, how do graduates of a dual language program characterize their bilingual and biliterate trajectories? And how has their bilingualism and biliteracy been conceptualized by them and by others? And how and in what ways has it functioned as a resource in their lives? And so just to briefly touch on a bit of the framework that I looked at in this research, based on past research as well as the literature. The new literacy studies framework is this idea of a social turn in literacy studies. So it's moving away from an individualistic view of people, practices, and institutions, and instead really focusing on social interactions and practices. So in this way, when we talk about literacy, it's understood through social, cultural, historical, economic, and political practices within which they're embedded. I also looked at this idea of communities of practice, and you'll hear me talk about this later in the presentation. The idea of a community of practice, it's part of a social learning theory, and in its most basic form, a community of practice is a group of people who regularly engage in some common endeavor, usually related to an interest or a position. So we focus on these specific domains and the idea that knowledge construction and learning is the product of shared participation within these different spaces and fields. I also talk about language and literacy ideologies. And so ideologies are conceptual, and they have to do with our consciousness, our subjectivities. They are also from and rooted in the social and related to economic, political, and social positions of power. The notion of capital describes how something, and in this case, we're talking about language, can be translated into an asset or a benefit for an individual. So Bourdieu and Luke have this notion of capital describes the ways that particular groups, social groups, reproduce privilege through economic, social, and cultural capital. And so when we think about capital when applied to language, this can help shed light on the ways that language can be viewed or translated into economic, social, cultural, as well as literacy capital as an asset or a benefit. And finally, the idea of language as resource is where language is viewed as a personal, community, national resource, and that can include social, cultural, economic, and political and educational benefits. I also thought about issues of time and space because I was looking at their bilingual and biliterate practices across these different domains or social fields, as well as over time as they grew from early childhood into adults. And I like this quote by Leander Phillips and Taylor, and it states, "How are the dynamically moving elements, not elephants, of social systems and distributions, including people themselves and all manner of resources for learning as well, configured and reconfigured across space and time to create opportunities to learn?" So a bit of background about Dalton. It was founded in 1901. As I mentioned, it's a dual language immersion school, kindergarten through 5th grade, and it's located in our local context in Barrio Amelia. This is also a pseudonym. Barrio Amelia is one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. It was populated mostly by Latino families of lower socioeconomic status, but also served other language minority families. And I should mention that all the designations that I will mention, Anglo-Latino, are self-described by participants, which is why I'm using these terms. Originally, Dalton was a monolingual school that only served children of Barrio Amelia. Dalton was one of the poorest schools with high dropout rates and generally low academic achievement compared to wealthier schools in the city. However, in 1981, after being faced with diminishing enrollment following a federal desegregation mandate, Dalton became a bilingual magnet school. And in 1994, it adopted its dual language immersion model, which we will look at in a second. So this meant that the school now served not only students from the neighborhood, Barrio Amelia, but also magnet students who came from anywhere in the city. Local neighborhood Barrio Amelia students made up approximately 35% of the student population, and the remaining 65% was composed of magnet students. Most magnet students were from middle-class households, and most barrio students were from low socioeconomic status households. As such, approximately 50% of the students qualified for free or reduced lunch. Now, the court-mandated desegregation order actually meant that Anglo students were given priority in school admission. So for the older cohort of participants in the study, students for the larger community who chose the designation of Hispanic on the school district application were actually put on a waiting list, which often stretched out for several years. One mother of a student in those years actually related how she stopped by the school district office on the way home from the hospital after giving birth to her daughter in order to place her on the waiting list. So as you can tell, it was a very popular program. Siblings were also given priority if the older child had already been admitted to the program. And because of its popularity, a lottery system was later put in place for the younger students, and that lottery system remains in place to date. So at the time that participants were students at this school, The student body was made up of approximately 250 students, 66% Latino, 23% Anglo, with African American, Native American, Asian American students comprising the remaining 11%. The majority of teachers, staff, and administrators were also Latino. The largest group of students were third or fourth generation Latino Americans. And despite this larger Latino population, most students actually entered the school as English dominant speakers. The bilingual school became popular as many Mexican American families hoped their children might retain or regain heritage language. The school was also well known for its emphasis on the arts, with exceptional mariachi music and folklorico dance programs. This was another reason that many parents desired to send their children here and drew many families for these exceptional programs. Here's a look at their curriculum model. As you can see, in kindergarten, they start with 100% Spanish and no English. And this transition by 5th grade, it transitions to 70% Spanish and 30% English. So it's important to keep in mind that within the classroom setting, their English never rose above 30%. So the emphasis in classroom instruction was definitely on Spanish, the minority language. The participants in this study, there were 52 of them, and they completed their 5th grade year at Dalton between 1997 and 2003. So they were students there during the mid-90s. And at the time the study was conducted, they were between the ages of 22 and 28. So they are now adults, and really in that those important years where they're making some big life decisions in their 20s. Here is a little chart here. You can see the participants. 65% were Latino. At the bottom, you can see this 90% of these participants had earned an associate's degree or higher. We will talk about that in a little bit. I want to briefly describe my data collection. First, there was a secure social network group created via an online discussion board on Facebook. And the cohort of participants were encouraged to post their thoughts and responses to questions periodically. They were also able to create and share media content. And what was great was that they were able to participate from their respective locations, because now many of them have moved away from the city. And so this served as a disembodied site to facilitate conversation in a convenient way that was utilizing the most recent technologies in a way that was familiar to participants of this age group. There were also 2 separate focus group discussions that were held. 10 participants were invited, and they participated in a mapping exercise where they were asked to recount specific groups and activities, i.e. communities of practice, they were involved in during each phase in school. So elementary school, middle school, high school, and post-high school. They wrote down their perceptions of how much Spanish, how much English were present in each of these spaces. And finally, 3 case study participants were interviewed 3 times to gain a more in-depth perspective. So Tara was an Anglo magnet student from an English-only household. Julieta was a Mexican-American magnet student from a bilingual household. And Jaime was a Mexican-American from Barrio Amelia, also from a bilingual household. And these 3 participants were selected because each one represented a uniquely different home life experience. They were each interviewed 3 times using, they were asked open-ended questions which focused on their life histories and exploring their past and present experiences regarding bilingualism and biliteracy. The data from the interviews, the discussion board, the focus groups, and the maps were all used in the final analysis. Focus group conversations and interviews were transcribed along with the discussion board postings. They were coded and analyzed for themes, patterns, and conclusions as they related to the research questions. So here's a look at one of the maps that these participants designated, these different spaces where they would use Spanish or English. So you can see elementary school, middle school, high school, and post-high school, as well as the category. I want you to note that the percentage of English remains much higher across these spaces and across time. Here you can see that English, their self-reported percentage of English used in these spaces is 83.1%. And here's another example. This is a post-high school map. And you can see the categories of spaces where they participate in a community of practice. So religious institution, athletics, relationships, clubs, organizations, employment, etc. And here's another example of some more communities of practice. Some of them still participate in mariachi groups or dance and folklorico groups, swim, soccer, cross country, church, school, etc. So what we learned from this mapping exercise is that these participants reported, again, that their English across these school levels tended to be a higher percentage in these spaces. So across these specific domains, this is their designation of how much of each language is used. And these are the focus group participants. Again, you can see the percentage of English is higher, self-reported, except for one student, Melody, which her Spanish is reported as higher. Interestingly, they were asked the question, do you believe that you're more, less, or equally bilingual and biliterate today as an elementary school? And 90% of them, 9 of them reported that they believed that they were more or equally bilingual as they were in elementary school. So interesting to think about how over time, most of them believe that they were able to maintain or grow in their bilingualism and biliteracy. So as we learn from the data, there were a few ideologies that came out that participants were held, and as they reflect specifically on their elementary school years. So the first ideology is the idea of linguistic privilege. This is the notion of Spanish as special. So this ideology was generally demonstrated by non-Hispanic Euro-American students. These students talked about how they did not feel a threat of a minority language, that Spanish was instead viewed as an asset in their English dominant surroundings. So for example, Tara, she was an Anglo student who moved away after elementary school. She actually moved to California out of the state. And she talked about how she took Spanish in high school, and because she was already bilingual, because of her experience at Dalton, that all of her peers would just say, wow, that's just so cool that you're bilingual. I can't believe you speak Spanish. And that for her, it was this asset that that others were, praising, and it was this idea that she was special because she had the ability to speak Spanish and to be bilingual. The second ideology is the idea of language as social practice, or Spanish as normalized. This ideology was generally held by Mexican Americans from middle-class households, often second or third generation. And they talked about how instruction in English and Spanish was just completely normal, that it was this fluid way of navigating between languages that mirrored their home life. So one participant, Julieta, for example, said that she was not even aware that she was part of a bilingual program, because at home and in her extended family, she would navigate between Spanish and English. The same was true at school. And so she said it wasn't until she had some neighborhood friends and they were not at her school that she realized, oh, not every school is bilingual. She didn't even realize that this was not the norm. And so this fluid navigation between languages was just something that was very, very normalized. And then finally, the last ideology is the idea of stigmatization of language, Spanish as undesirable. So students who displayed this language ideology came from Barrio Amelia, often and from lower socioeconomic status. And these students were often resistant to Spanish from a young age. So here's some examples of quotes from these students. One states, when I started Dalton, I did not want to learn Spanish. I remember being a really difficult student because I refused to learn the slightest bit of Spanish. I remember being really reluctant to learn Spanish. I was around it all the time at home, so I guess I just didn't want to speak it at school. And Valerie, an African-American student, recounts, I remember rejecting Spanish a lot when it was first being taught to me. I remember I would have to go to the bathroom, and because they made you ask in Spanish, I never wanted to say it in Spanish, so I would just hold it. So these students likely connected the Spanish language not only to the barrio, but to low socioeconomic status, viewing English as the way to get out of the barrio and by extension out of poverty and into a better job. It must be noted that not all barrio students held the Spanish as undesirable language ideology. However, within the participants, the Spanish as undesirable ideology was only connected to students who came from Barrio Amelia and or lower socioeconomic status households. So of the 13 participants in the study who came from Barrio Amelia, 6 demonstrated this ideology. However, today, as we learned from them as adults, the idea of Spanish as special, many of those students hold a very similar ideology today. They feel like it is an asset to them in their daily lives that they are bilingual. Spanish is normalized. Many of these students now actually view their early language and literacy experiences as exceptional rather than normal, because at the time they didn't realize that it was anything special, but now they're seeing, oh wow, that was actually a really unique experience that I had in elementary school. And now looking back as adults, the idea of Spanish is undesirable. These students today are not only are they no longer resistant to Spanish, they have demonstrated overwhelmingly positive ideologies towards Spanish, as well as their early language and literacy experiences at Dalton. So here's an excerpt from a focus group. I remember we couldn't fathom why people would think speaking Spanish was bad, like what's wrong? Yeah, we've been doing this for how long? It was just the norm to us. Exactly. Well, it was the norm to us, but now we know it was a privilege. And now when I think about it, when I have kids, I have to put them in a bilingual school, like there's no other way. In the year 2000, Proposition 203 represented a critical juncture for these participants. So the state of Arizona passed Proposition 203, which mandated English as the language of instruction, essentially making bilingual education programs illegal. This really represented a turning point in the state's political actions regarding language and education. So in the year 2000, the participants' grades ranged from 2nd grade to 7th grade. Many of the students had different reactions to the proposition, and some were more affected than others. Particularly for the older children, this proposition represented a critical time in their understanding of these deeper issues surrounding language. They had more of an understanding of what was going on. Many of the students actually campaigned against the proposition. They recall standing on the street with signs, chanting or singing and campaigning against the proposition. So from this very young age, they were aware of these issues. Jaime says, bilingual education was so natural is the first time I would know that people would have a problem with it, because everyone I knew went to Dalton and it was such a positive thing. And I use this word really carefully. It was my first introduction to what I think was some ignorance. Learning two languages is so important, so I never understood why it would be a problem. And I just remember some of the arguments. It became very racially fueled. Interestingly, many of the students, instead of internalizing the negative discourse the state was trying to impose surrounding bilingual education, they were instead more influenced by the anti-203 pro-bilingual education discourse. As this one student states, I think it made me more determined to speak her language or to fight against these types of policies. The following anecdote was by a participant who was in 6th grade at the time of the proposition. She states, my sister and I went to dance class and most of the girls there were Mexican, but English speakers like us, but they didn't go to our school. So my friend's mom was handing out these buttons with 203 with a slash through it. And so my friend's mom went to give it to another mom and she was Mexican, but she said, oh no, I won't take that. And my friend's mom was like, why? And she said, because it hurts us, saying that learning Spanish in schools hurts us, meaning Mexican Americans, because then the kids won't be successful if they don't learn English. You know, the whole argument. And I remember being like totally shocked because I had pictured, you know, misinformed politicians living up in northern Arizona or something. But then to see my friend's Mexican mom who was against bilingual ed, it was literally the first time that I even knew there was another point of view. I think it made me more aware of those issues. So this example frames the polarization of language and community, that one cannot assume that because one speaks a particular language or has a language in their family background, that a prescribed linguistic ideology will follow. Next, we have the notion of Spanish as capital. Social and cultural capital. Language opened up opportunities for increased social interactions and relationships. For example, one participant who lives locally in a predominantly Hispanic community, and she herself is Anglo, she says, I'm accepted into the culture that I locally live in because of the language. Now, people assume I'm Latina. Everybody thinks that I am, and they have to be honest, but I'm Mexicana in my heart. Then there's this idea of economic capital. So participants describe having increased opportunity for employment because of their bilingualism. One participant even described how he himself was an employer, and that in looking at hiring candidates, bilingualism was a desirable trait that he would look for in applicants. So many of them reported that they felt like their bilingualism translated into economic capital. And then there's this idea of literacy capital. These students have access to reading material in both languages, though often they describe that their default is going to always be English because it's just more widely available. But some of them describe engaging in reading and online articles in Spanish. 7 of the participants have minors in Spanish, 2 had majors in Spanish, and 1 held a master's degree in Spanish. So for these students, Spanish very literally became a form of literacy capital through educational gains. Again, capital is talking about this asset or this benefit to them in their lives. The idea of resource carries different circumstances and consequences, and it's not necessarily implicit when a language is, quote, valued. So the notion of language as resource, when applied to an individual life story, it becomes more complex when you factor in questions such as, when is it a resource? Where is it a resource? For whom is it a resource? Meaning, who are the beneficiaries of this resource? So at Dalton, as mentioned, Anglo students were given priority in enrollment because of the court-mandated desegregation order. Yet Spanish-speaking Latino students were underrepresented in enrollment. So this factor alone speaks to the question of who was giving access to the resource of a second language and bilingualism, and is there a way to extend equity and access in a way that embraces the idea of multilingualism for all students from all backgrounds. So where are the students now? As mentioned, 90% have earned at least an associate's degree, which is a very impressive statistic. Tara is a participant that I mentioned earlier. She's from an Anglo household, and She states, I remember being at the grocery store one time with my mom and her running into someone and she knew, and she was like, oh my goodness, your girls are so big. Where do they go to school? My mom said, oh, they go to Dalton. And I remember her saying, how could you send them to Dalton? Aren't there a lot of gangs there? Don't they have really low test scores? Isn't it a bunch of Mexicans? I remember my parents getting asked that a lot. So this anecdote, this perception shows that often there's this perception associated with bilingual schooling that is both racially driven and tied to some belief that because of the language aspect, that the school must actually lack academic rigor, which was actually not the case for Dalton. Dalton consistently had reported and had very high test scores, and students had very high economic, educational and testing achievement at Dalton. There was also this notion of advocacy and increased global awareness. So a large number of graduates reflect advocacy in their words and their actions. Many of them were Peace Corps fellows. They're very politically active, involved in local nonprofit organizations, and just in general are activists for their respective causes. So this idea that there's this larger sense of community and giving back, a sense of sensitivity to issues of diversity and minoritized populations, given this more global perspective and understanding of their place in society. So there is some research that shows that students who are engaged in programs that encourage activism and critical consciousness actually have higher student achievement rates. Collier and Thomas have some data about how dual language programs are successful at closing the achievement gap and have higher academic success for its students as well. So we need to remember that language and literacy are non-linear. You're not just learning language sequentially, linearly over time. Instead, they're situated within practice. So across these different spaces and domains, there are these interactions taking place. So we don't need to ask whether a person is bilingual, biliterate, but we need to ask what contexts enable, enhance, or constrain bilingualism and biliteracy. So we can begin to see beyond language and literacy as this ability or something that one possesses, but instead discover the ways in which participants participate in and are navigating through these domains, these communities of practice, with this capacity for knowledge construction within these spaces. So the findings illustrate the dynamic nature of bilingualism across contexts, but that there's this fluid movement across fields in remarkable ways. Wallerstein describes something called a transformational timespace, which fundamentally alters the way that the world is understood, profoundly provoking and influencing future acts and events. So for these participants, the dual language school acted as a transformational time space, one that fundamentally was transformative for their worldviews, their past and their current experiences. However, even as a transformational time space, the school in and of itself was not the only condition in producing lifelong bilingual and biliterate graduates. As was shown in the mapping exercises, it was these out-of-school spaces where participants' language and literacy were and are expanded through shared practice and interactions. Participants have multiple and varied opportunities to use Spanish, written and orally in their daily lives, yet they describe still turning to English. As you saw across all these spaces, English was still the dominant language. So within a historically complex context, we have these perceptions and values surrounding Spanish and its speakers. And there are these larger debates transpiring about standardization of language, and languages can be perceived to be in competition. So even in this case, it was a remarkably bilingual and bicultural community. Yet the hegemony of English still supersedes the purposeful intention to privilege the minority language, as was the case at Dalton. Many efforts to limit language diversity in schools because of this perceived threat to a national unifying language, hence with Proposition 203. So this research actually provides evidence that English is not endangered and that dual language schooling in fact provides opportunities for students to construct their language identities in multiple and complex ways. The following statement can be found on the Dalton website. At Dalton, we celebrate diversity with a magnet focus that provides children with a bilingual curriculum and emphasizes the beauty of diverse cultures as well as an awareness of social justice themes. So as we recognize the many practices students engage in outside of the classroom, and by sustaining and valuing not only their own cultural identities and heritages, but that we actually sustain the idea of multiculturalism. So there's this notion of culturally sustaining pedagogy, that we are sustaining culture within the classroom. And I extend this notion to consider multicultural sustaining pedagogy, creating sensitivity to issues of diversity and connection to a heritage land, validating and sustaining students' rich linguistic communicative practices, both inside and outside of the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I love this. And before I go with my questions, there was a couple here. So I wanted to make sure to get the audience questions first, since we have a few minutes. In cases such as Valerie, a student resisted speaking Spanish and would, quote, hold it when the restroom was necessary, what recommendations do you make to teachers who find themselves coaching or encouraging students to assert themselves and be more confident in their language praxis?
That's a great question. At the school, the teachers, well, first of all, as mentioned, the school really tried to emphasize both languages, but in some ways privilege Spanish because, as was demonstrated, English is so prevalent in these out-of-school spaces. And so if they're not getting it in the classroom, often they're not getting it. And so first, I must also note that the language in the classroom was not the same as peer interactions on the playground, et cetera. So on the playground and in peer interactions outside the classroom, often English was the dominant or the language of preference for these students. And so that carries significance, especially as there are some students who came from Spanish-speaking households. Children get these messages from all these different channels at all times about which language matters, or which one they view as the language they're going to need for specific interactions, etc. And so for teachers, the way that they tried to foster bilingualism was to really emphasize the minority language. Now, if a student is showing resistance, I would first recommend that we don't force anything. We just try to provide an environment that is fun. First and foremost, language learning should be fun, and it should be something that they want to engage in, and it shouldn't feel like a struggle, or that we just want it to be something that they're enjoying. And so in Valerie's case, for the teacher, I would just recommend keeping these opportunities for them to have positive language learning experiences, and just over time watch as they evolve and in their thinking, and hopefully grow in their language and literacy practices as well as ideologies.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's see, I have another one. First, Karen says, thanks for sharing your research. And if you could, please comment on the, quote, language ideologies. Did they emerge from the data, or were those three categories set up as priority? Were these ideologies a surprise to you in any way? For example, was there an ideology you didn't expect to emerge, but didn't?
Also a great question. So these did emerge from the data and I was not expecting them. So in my experience as a student there, my ideology was the Spanish as normalized because my home and language background mirrored what was going on at school because I come from a Mexican American family. We had a lot of translanguaging, navigating between Spanish and English in my extended family. So my experience at Dalton was that it was a very normal thing, and it wasn't, again, till sometimes as you reflect back, you realize, oh, this wasn't just like any other school. There were some specific and special practices taking place here. I think what surprised me was the resistance to Spanish, because I don't think I personally witnessed that. I also didn't experience that resistance. But as I thought about it, it makes a lot of sense for these students to hold a Spanish as undesirable ideology, especially if they are connecting it to, you know, a lower socioeconomic status and seeing English as this vehicle to economic prosperity. And so while it was not something I was looking for, it was definitely something that came out with those particular barrio students. But again, interesting to note that now as adults, they don't reflect those ideologies anymore. In fact, they, quite the opposite, are very positive about their early language and literacy experiences at Dalton.
That's, yeah, I love that. Thank you. Let's see, I'm reading another one. Is there a movement to expand bilingual schools in Arizona or nationally? This one comes from Flagstaff that has a trilingual school, English, Spanish, and Dene. That's fascinating. I had no idea about that.
I'm not aware of any national movement at this time. I think every state kind of has their own, you know, state mandates and policies. We definitely, you know, it's language and schooling is very political, and so it varies from state to state. So I'm aware, because I was in Utah, they have several 50-50 is the curriculum model, dual language schools in Utah statewide, and it's not just Spanish. They have Mandarin, they have other languages. So I'm aware of that in Utah, but I'm not aware of anything nationally. It really comes down to the state.
That makes sense, right? And it is political, as we can see, and that comes to our next question here. One, Rex wants to say, excellent presentation. What are some of the political implications of this research, given the hostile climate against bilingual ed, at least from your perspective?
Well, it all comes down to what policies are implemented in the schools. I mean, we are in this era right now with high stakes standardized testing, and often there's resistance to alternative models, and bilingual education is not commonplace. And so as was shown with Proposition 203, often when it comes to language, it can become very racially fueled, and there are arguments on both sides of the spectrum. And so it just is left up to us as citizens, as parents, as educators, to be able to show our support of these types of programs in whatever ways that we can. And I love that these students were actively engaged in these efforts to campaign against this proposition that affected them directly. And in my opinion, this really transformed them in all of their thinking as young adults and adults now, with these issues surrounding language and literacy, because they were around these issues at an early age, and they have this very personal connection to bilingual education.
Yeah. You know, I also remark on, we all know, right, the studies that learning different language exercises different parts of brain, that so that the standardized test at Dalton being higher, right, doesn't surprise me, because they're learning different things in different ways. So it's interesting how that argument kind of is buried sometimes. Michelle asks, first, thank you for your presentation. And her question is, did the Spanish heritage students discuss how their Spanish use and abilities were viewed by their teachers? In reference to the resistance, did they discuss how others might have shaped their perceptions as opposed to it being maybe being about their own views of Spanish?
So Jaime, one of the participants, he was so interesting, his experiences. Jaime was from Barrio Amelia, and he showed resistance to Spanish from a very young age. And he talks about how Dalton had these very caring teachers who really tried to reach out to him. He had dyslexia and had a resistance to reading, and just was kind of this pattern that school did not come easy to him, and he just was struggling a little bit. And he talks about how one teacher, for example, he was very interested in animals, and she bought him a subscription to National Geographic animal. She bought him this subscription because he couldn't afford it in his family, and that was the first way that he started to engage in reading on his own, because she just went above and beyond. And as he's grown, he's talked about how he even today has this insecurity because, and this is something I didn't touch on, but many of the students who are not native Spanish speakers, they learned Spanish at Dalton or almost as a second language because they were English dominant speakers, feel somewhat self-conscious, especially when speaking with a native Spanish speaker, because there's always this idea of my Spanish is not good enough. I look like I should speak perfect Spanish, and maybe I don't, or I still have some insecurities about it. And that's a real thing, linguistic insecurity. And Jaime talks about how as he's grown, he had a very negative experience when he went to Guadalajara in Mexico, and he's a very talented musician. Many of these participants were part of the mariachi music programs, and he went to Guadalajara with his mariachi group, and he was speaking Spanish down there, and he felt criticized by some of the local natives native Spanish speakers, and he felt like his Spanish wasn't good enough, and he said he just closed up. And after that, he was just very, very afraid to speak Spanish for many years. He said it really affected him in many ways. And he would just always, someone might speak to him in Spanish, he would answer in English. And this was a pattern. And then in his later years, he would travel out of the country oftentimes for work. And he found himself in I believe it was Paris, but he was out of the country, and someone there had told him, they actually like Spanish speakers over here. You should probably speak Spanish instead of English, because everyone here speaks lots of languages. And he said that in this trip, he actually started speaking Spanish, and it was in this setting that was valuing multilingualism, where there were these speakers of all of these different languages, and he switched to Spanish because of something his coworker told him. And he said it was the first time since that trip in Guadalajara that he felt like released of these inhibitions and this linguistic insecurity. And he just said it was like, but then he came back here, and it was like it happened again. Like he had this fear of speaking Spanish. And so my perception of that was that it was this idea of, in a place where multilingualism was valued, and again, Spanish is seen as this asset, this benefit, he was able to kind of just be able to speak freely. And then back here, he's internalized these ideologies of Spanish is undesirable, and he kind of just has this hard time getting past so many of these political and other perspectives regarding Spanish. And so first, that shows that language ideology is fluid, and it can change across contexts, across time. We don't just have one perception of our language or identity as bilinguals, biliterate humans, but it also just shows that context matters, and that just proves even more that we have to create these spaces, whether in school or in our own homes or families and communities, that are valuing multilingualism.
Thank you. I kind of had a quick question. I too was shocked. Well, not really shocked. I understand that the Mexican American mom who didn't want bilingual, that was kind of against bilingual education and everything. Did you find like there was a generational divide also, maybe like grandparents who had been maybe punished for speaking Spanish and didn't want, you know, their children or children's children talking Spanish because of the historical policing of language, particularly with Spanish in the borderlands?
Yes, Julieta, a different participant, also had a story about how when she was entering preschool, prior to that, she had been very bilingual, but her mom had planned to send her to a preschool, and her grandma got very adamant that she needed to go to an English only preschool because she was looking at a bilingual preschool. And she said she needs to learn English. She is going to, basically just emphasizing that English was important. And she talks about how, because in her grandma's time, she was one of those that was punished for speaking Spanish, she just held on to this belief that, oh no, my grandchild's going to go through what I went through. She has to learn English. I don't want her to go to this bilingual preschool. And she said there was this little power struggle between her mom and her grandma really felt firmly. And obviously her mom is the mom, and she ended up going to the bilingual preschool as well as Dalton. And now she is very grateful and feels her identity as a bilingual person. But yes, that definitely came from her grandma, and others have similar anecdotes that there were punitive measures of being punished for speaking Spanish, or students who internalize that, and then that certainly can be passed down to children and grandchildren.
Yeah, definitely found that that third generation is a key that really never learned Spanish for those reasons in my historical, actors. So I think we have time for just one more question that I think is a good ending question from Karen's asking if you would like to share with us anything about your plans for future research or projects, maybe that you're going to be working on. I think they want more of your stuff.
Thank you. So currently, as mentioned in the beginning, I do work with a bilingual preschool curriculum. With my sister and I have developed this curriculum, and something that I am interested in is just the households that they're coming from, these parents who are motivated for their children to learn a second language. Often they don't know where to start or how to begin that bilingual journey, and so I would be interested in learning more from these parents and their households, and how they're going to begin that bilingual journey from a very young early age.
Thank you so much. And we're almost out of time, so I don't want to get to a start. I could ask you a million questions, but I'm not going to. I want to thank you for sharing your research. I want to thank everybody in the audience for your amazing questions, and for coming to this program on a beautiful Saturday. I know that the weather is starting to be nice and people are getting vaccinated, thank goodness, and you have options. But we really here at AHS want to bring more programs like this. We really want to reach more communities, and I think language is one of the most important. And so I want to thank you for taking your time and your research and spending your Saturday with us. So thank you, Dr. Granados. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you for everybody, and come join us at our next virtual program. Thank you very much.